So we are right now in a season that, for all intents and purposes here in this country, we could just call pre-Christmas. After Thanksgiving, we shift gears, get in the mode of preparing for Christmas, looking forward to Christmas. Now, it might be a little less of a thing these days, but I remember growing up, Black Friday was the day you'd go to the mall, right? Or else to Best Buy or someplace like that. You might even camp out early to get in on the Black Friday sales. These days, you're probably just camping out on your computer so you can get on Amazon. But anyway, I remember that. That once Thanksgiving happens, you shift into preparing for Christmas, buying stuff for Christmas, planning travel and family gatherings for Christmas. You go to places, you're going to hear Christmas music playing. Predictably, in our culture, there's probably going to be now debates and arguments about whether we call it Christmas or holiday season. That's sort of become a tradition in our country as well. Well, the church calendar has a different approach. The idea of the church calendar goes back centuries now, where the church has divided up the year into different parts, different seasons, different focuses at these different parts of the year. And over time, churches also created a common lectionary where there's certain Bible verses that you read in your own quiet time, and then Bible verses that the church, you talk about and preach about at these various seasons. And so this season that we've begun now is called Advent. It's the season of Advent. And Advent starts the church year. This season comes at the end of the Gregorian calendar or our traditional calendar? But in the church calendar, Advent is like January 1. Advent, this first Sunday of Advent now, starts the new year. And Advent then goes from now until Christmas Eve, and then after Christmas Eve, you have the 12 days of Christmas, sometimes called Christmastide. And so we know what the Christmas season is all about, but what's Advent all about? Advent has its own focus. It's not simply gearing up for Christmas. It's about something else. Advent is about waiting. It's about looking forward. It's about longing for Christ to come, to fix what is broken, to rescue what is lost, to save us, right? We're looking for the Messiah to come to save us. It focuses our attention on the problems and challenges and the incompleteness we experience in life. That something is missing. We're stressed out about stuff. We are living with certain needs while we're waiting for Christ to return. We're looking for Christ to come and fix it. So just like in the Old Testament era, when we see the Christmas story, they're kind of at the end, the first Christmas story, they're at the end of this Old Testament era, and they have been looking forward for the Messiah to come. Now we are in this season or in this era, historical era, we are we're longing for the Messiah to return, for Christ to come again, and for the struggles and challenges that we're facing now, for Christ to come back and to right those wrongs or to end the suffering. And so what is that suffering that we're experiencing today? What is that challenge that we're struggling with, or challenges that we're struggling with? And I would want to put it around one big word. If there's one thing that I think a word you might use to characterize the world we're living in today, that word is fear. You could put it this way. The great challenge of our time is not so much even war or economic problems or community unrest or prejudice or division. It's fear. Now, you go, well, come on. I mean, war, that's terrible. All these things are really terrible, but the thing of it is, fear is at the root of all of those other things. If we don't deal with this challenge, then these other things we're never going to make progress in them. For some of these problems, fear is like the root cause of them. But for others, even though it's not the root cause, it makes them worse and makes them almost unsolvable. We live with so much fear and suspicion that it makes it almost impossible to deal with these other problems that are happening in our lives. Now, I know I talk about this a lot, and so I don't want to belabor it today, but we do need to be reminded of this periodically, and it fits here, so I'm just going to say it again. We live in a world that's very, very unique, historically unique. And it's unique in some ways that are good, and it's unique in some ways that are not so good. More so today than at any other time in history, we are immersed in information. We are exposed to all the information that there is, we have access to. Not only do we have access to it, but it's being constantly pushed to us. We're aware of anything and everything that's happening in the world. We can find out what it is. We can learn about it. We hear about it. And if it's bad stuff, I guarantee we're hearing about it. Not only do we hear about it, we witness it. You know, back in the day, people would maybe hear rumors about certain things that were happening, but we're seeing live video or recorded video, and we're kind of almost immersed in the experience of it, and so we're exposed to all this tragedy and suffering that's going on in any corner of the world because we're getting virtual experience of it. But that's not the worst of it. In our attention economy, where there's so many influencers and media outlets and corporations, all these organizations and people fighting for our attention, to get our attention, for the message to cut through, the only thing that cuts through is the really shrill voice. It's the super scary statistic. So we're drowning in hate and panic. And that's kind of like goldfish living in a bowl and they're swimming in this water. That's the water that we're swimming in all the time. That's what we're immersed in. So, the first Sunday of Advent speaks directly to this. It speaks directly to people living in challenging times, in scary times. Now, before we get into looking at this passage, Jesus is speaking in this passage. It comes towards the end of his ministry. I want to say just a little bit of a word to help us. How do we think about passages like this? How do we interpret them? How do we understand them? This section here is where Jesus is talking about the end times. And this is kind of like prophetic teaching. In fact, the technical term is it's apocalyptic teaching. Apocalyptic literature is actually a form of literature in the ancient world. The book of Daniel, for example, at least the last part of it is apocalyptic literature. The book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature, and certain parts of the Gospels are apocalyptic. Now, how do we understand apocalyptic literature? How do we make sense of these passages? And I'm going to guess we've all had certain experiences with them. I'm going to tell you a story about mine. I remember I was 19 at the time. I'd taken off. I'd left college. I was going to be a full-time musician. I was in a band, a Christian rock band, and we toured around. And at this point, we were touring in the South, and we played mostly at churches and schools. And sometimes other events. And this time, they brought us in to play at a revival, a Southern revival. I think it was like in Kentucky or Georgia. And they brought in, so we played the music, and then they brought in an evangelist to give the message. And if you have whatever stereotype you might have in your head about a Southern evangelist, this guy was the epitome of that. He had a big, booming, deep voice, deep Southern drawl. He would say the word God with about 3 syllables, just drag it out. So we sang the opening part, and then he took over and gave an hour-long message, and I'll never forget it. It was all about the book of Revelation And it was about how the things that were in Revelation, how they were happening right now. I'm going to date myself a little bit. This was like in the 80s, the Reagan era. And remember, there lots of conflict at that point between the U.S. and Russia, and fears about World War III. And so in this sermon, he made a lot of connections between how Russia and the things that were happening today were directly the fulfillment of these certain prophecies in the book of Revelation. And he was good. I went away from that sermon thinking that Jesus was about to come back, any day now. And then, what happened, right? Nothing happened. The world just kept on turning. Fast forward a few years later, I'm now a pastor. I'm in Austin, Texas. And there was another pastor of another really big church, a mega church, another part of Texas. I'm not going to say where. You would know this name. I'm not going to say who it is. And he had a show on Christian TV. And at this point, my dad had injured his back, and he just was not really able to get around. So he watched a lot of TV at this point. He was watching all the Christian TV, and he became a fan of this preacher. And so when my parents came down to visit us, he wanted to go and hear this preacher. And so we did. We went over to this other town, this other city, and they were also having a revival event. And he was preaching this, and he was preaching on, you guessed it, Revelation, and talking about how the current times were proof that Jesus was about to come back. Now, this time, China played played heavily in these predictions, and I think also he was making connections to drug cartels, the rise of drug cartels, how that was specific fulfillments of the prophecies in the book of Revelation, and Jesus was about to come back. And it dawned on me, preachers have been doing this a long time. Looking at apocalyptic literature and pointing to certain passages and connecting them to whatever the events are of the day, which then leads you to think that, okay, we're in the end times now. Jesus is about to come back tomorrow. Can you imagine what it was like when World War I was raging? I'm sure preachers were getting up and talking about the world events and how that was proof that Jesus was coming back. Or what about World War II? Then you have like 1969 with all the turmoil and war and social upheaval. I'm sure that at that point there were different preachers looking at different events and tying them to the same passages. And then 1984, and then 1996, and then 1999. Remember the fears that when we switched from 1999 to the year 2000, the computers weren't going to work and the world was going to, implode. I'm sure you could go to an evangelistic rally somewhere today and hear some preacher doing the same thing, pointing to the same passages and making connections to what's happening today. And as proof that Jesus is going to come back, maybe at the end of 2025 or maybe sometime in 2026. And maybe Jesus will. And that would be awesome, wouldn't it? It would be great if Jesus would come back. And he might come back at any time. My point in bringing all this up is not to make us cynical about Jesus coming back. We look forward to that. But my point is to make us cynical about our attempts to pinpoint how specific prophecies relate to specific events in history and then making the connection so that we think we can build a timeline. It doesn't work like that. So how do we make sense of these passages then? First off, to say some things about apocalyptic passages. First off, we may not realize this, but there is a lot of them. This was a very common literary device or literary form, especially in Jesus' time. Archaeologists today continue to find more and more ancient literature that is apocalyptic kind of literature, talking about how the world is, these terrible things are going to happen and how to live during that time. There's a lot of it, and what we have in the Bible it's a very small fraction of the other kinds of stuff that was out there at the time. Second thing to know about apocalyptic literature, whether it be Daniel, Revelation, or what Jesus says here, is that it's not linear or sequential in terms of what it's saying and how it's pointing to things. It's not like this is going to happen and then 2 years later or 5 years later that's going to happen and then 10 years later that's going to happen. It's maybe better to think of it more like a dream, like a flashes of images. When you have dreams, what you remember is certain specific things happening, but it's not like a long story. It's just flashes of images or experiences, and that's kind of like how you might want to think about apocalyptic literature. It presents us flashes of things that are to come, but not only that, they might also be things that were happening to the very people who were in that particular time. So in other words, it might be talking about things that were actually happening at the very time that it was being written, or it might be prophesied about things that were going to happen in that generation, but later in that generation. And that's what's happening in our passage. You may not have caught it, but that's exactly what's happening in this passage. We're in Luke 21. Look at verse 8. I'm going to walk through this a little bit. Jesus says, "Watch out that you are not deceived. Many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am he,' and the time is near, but don't follow them. When you hear of wars and uprisings, don't be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom." I'm now at verse 11. "There will be great earthquakes and famines and pestilence in various places, and fearful events and great signs from heaven." So you just stop there for a second. You go, okay, yeah. When you read that, you're thinking that, how that might be taking place today, and some of these things might be taking place now, and you might even have heard preachers talk about these as signs to watch out for, as proof that we're living in the end times, that Christ's return is very near. But keep reading. Jump down to verse 12. Jesus says, "But before this, they will seize you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, and all on account of my name, and so you will bear testimony to me." So now he's talking about things that are happening to them, that are going to happen to them, the disciples he's talking to, the people who are his listeners, the Luke who's writing this gospel, talking about the things that are probably going to happen to the people who are reading it. Now, go back to our particular text that we had this morning, verse 25. "There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People will faint from terror, apprehensive about what is going on, what is coming in the world. Heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory." So this looks like a pretty clear and obvious description of the end of the world, the very end times. The world comes to an end. Christ returns on a cloud of glory. But then jump down to verse 32. Look at verse 32. "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." What? These things are going to happen in this generation before you guys die? This is all going to happen? So what's happening here is Jesus is talking about things that will happen in their generation, things that will happen in future generations, and the timeline is not always exactly clear, just like Daniel, just like Revelation. He's talking about things that will happen, but again, the particular timeline is not, it's not written in a way, or it's not spoken in a way that you can go, okay, here, and then this is going to happen. The point is not about prediction. The point is, how do we live right now? What's going on in the world? What's going to be happening? How do we make sense of it? But mostly, how does that shape how we live now? Put it this way. The point is, the key point is, it's not prediction, but rather prescription. What Jesus is saying here, what Daniel is saying in his book, what John says in the book of Revelation, they're describing these wild things that are happening, some of which were maybe already happening in the lives of the people that they were reading it. Some might have been about to happen to them, some of which were going to happen in future generations. Nothing about this is intended to give us an accurate timeline about these things. Mostly it's about giving us a prescription for how to live when our world goes out of control. How do we deal with it? How do we respond and live when the world is going crazy? Now, there's some debate about the Gospel of Luke when it was written and when it was distributed in the early church, but most scholars agree that it was sometime around the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in AD 70. And conservative scholars believe it happened sometime before this. Other scholars would say it maybe happened a little bit after that. But the temple being destroyed in AD 70 was a huge apocalyptic event for the Jews of that generation. The temple was the epicenter of God's work in the world to them. And that's where they went to worship, and that's where God dwelt. And everything about their nation, their life, their worship was built around this temple. Every Jew wherever they were, the goal was, the plan was that they would come to the temple at least once a year. So they would come to this place, and then in AD 70, it's destroyed. And the Roman army takes over Jerusalem. A lot of people are killed. It's a time of great suffering. And so this has got to be one of the things that's going on here, is that Jesus is giving them instruction, and Luke recalls this and puts it in the gospel to help them make sense of how the world was going to fall apart for them. But it also then applies to, as time goes on, in future generations, and how world gets crazy, and at some point it's going to end. We don't know exactly when, but here's a prescription for how to live. So what is that prescription? How does Jesus tell the listeners, how does he tell us to live? So there's three things. I'll point these out. The first, in verse 26 and 28, there's do's and don'ts here. So the first is don't be afraid. When all this stuff's going on, when there's a lot of change, when there's the potential, when there's danger and threat, there's a temptation for us to hold back in fear, to be dominated by fear. And Jesus doesn't want that. Now, he doesn't use the phrase, you won't see the words, don't be afraid, but instead what he says is, like in verse 28, he says that when all these things take place, when there's all this great distress, he says, when these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. That's like saying, don't be afraid. Just stand firm. Now, people have differed a little bit, again, about how they understand what Jesus is saying here. Why should they not be afraid? What should give them the courage to stand when these terrible things are happening? So one option is, don't be afraid, stand when these bad things are happening, because you can be confident that Jesus is going to come back in just a few days or few weeks. You can be not afraid because you know that the world is about to end and the suffering is going to go away because Jesus is going to come back. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's an accurate interpretation at all. If that were the case, then Jesus was wrong about the future because the future went on in generations after this was written. He says here that this generation is not going to pass away before all these things are happening, but then other things happen. So here's another way of looking at it. Rather, that Jesus is encouraging us. He's comforting his disciples and says, when all this terrible stuff is going to happen or is going on, don't be afraid because you know that even when it's happening, redemption is near. The kingdom of God is near. In other words, that even when these bad things are happening, that God's help is going to come into your life. That his grace and power are going to come into your life. And that the kingdom of God, which is the reign of God, the realm where God's will is being done, that is at work, and it's at work in your life and will continue to be at work in the world. So heaven and earth will pass away, Jesus says, but my words will not pass away. That's verse 33. So that even when things are uncertain, you can trust that the teaching that I've given you is still relevant, and the kingdom of God is still near. It's with you. So don't be afraid. Stand up. Even when things are crazy, lift up your heads because your redemption, salvation is near to you. Even in the midst of chaos and uncertainty, the kingdom is available to you. Okay, the second thing he says, this is a do. So don't be afraid, but do be careful. Verse 34. He encourages people to be, courageous in the midst of this craziness, but he also tells them to be careful. Verse 34, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Then verse 34, be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with dissipation, drunkenness, and the anxieties of life, and that day will close on you unexpectedly like a trap. So be calm, but also be careful, because Jesus knows that when the going gets rough, when we struggle, when we suffer, when we have anxiety, it's tempting to give ourselves over to that anxiety. And it's tempting in the midst of that then to give ourselves over to other stuff. And he calls it, one translation is dissipation, distractions, drunkenness, giving ourselves over to any kind of relief or, something that might distract us or numb us, the ways that we artificially deal with our stress, anxiety, and fear. And it's no accident that in our world today, where there is so much stress, all this information I was talking about, so much anxiety, this pressure that people feel, it's no accident that it's also the time that addictions of all kinds are exploding. We're looking for ways to distract ourselves, to numb ourselves, to comfort ourselves. Now, some of the ways that we distract ourselves and comfort ourselves are maybe not bad in and of themselves, but they become bad because we give ourselves over to them and they become addictions. Or maybe we use them to numb and distract ourselves in a way that's not healthy. And so Jesus says, be careful how you live. Be careful that these things don't pull you away. And then finally, the third is be ready. Verse 36, be ready, always be ready. Be always on the watch and pray that you may not be able to escape, or that you may be able to escape what's about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. It's okay. Certainly pray that you won't have to suffer any more than you need to suffer. Pray that you can be spared of some of this suffering, but be ready, be prepared. And this reminds me, this is Luke's gospel. In Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, when he has kind of the parallel account, he also includes another parable that Jesus tells in connection with this prediction, or this time of predicting things. And he has this discourse, and it's called the parable of the 10 virgins. And the way that parable works is, so these at that time when there were weddings, they had a procession where the bridegroom would come, and it would be at night, and he would come in the dark to the place where the wedding feast was going to be. And what would happen then is the bridal attendants, in this case, they're sometimes referred to as virgins or bridal attendants, the bridal party, would go out to meet the groom with lights, and then they would light the way for the groom to come to the party. And in this parable, the groom takes a long time to get there, and these 10 virgins, 5 of them have extra oil for their lamps, and 5 of them don't. And so they fall asleep, and they wake up and their lamps are out, and now the bride's coming, or the bridegroom is coming rather. And so 5 of them are like the Boy Scouts, and they have brought extra oil, so they're prepared, and so they're able to go out to meet the groom. The other 5 have to run to Walmart to pick up some more oil. They didn't want to go to Walmart because they thought it might be closed, and of course it was closed. Then they went to Casey's, and Casey's was open, but the oil was more expensive there. But anyway, they got it there, but then when they came back to the wedding, it was too late. The doors were closed already, and they were locked, and so they were locked out. So the point of the parable is, be ready, be prepared. So, as we enter the Advent season, let's remember what it's really about. That is, living with this awareness of life not being the way that it should, and longing for the rights to be made wrong, for justice to be done, that God's kingdom would come in its fullness, that the Messiah, that Christ would come back. And how do we live in that time of uncertainty? How do we live in this time? Don't be afraid. Stand up, lift up your heads. The kingdom of God is near. You have something, we all have something solid that we can hold on to. And then be careful how you live. Don't let distractions and anxieties pull you away from what matters most. And then finally, be prepared, be ready. Don't assume you've got it all figured out. Stay alert, stay faithful. That's the relevance of Advent in frightening times. This is how we can live when the world's falling apart.